Hello, hello, and welcome once again to the David Messiah YouTube channel, where our watchwords are to teach and to build back up the kingdom of Zion. This is part two, this presentation, of the appointed time. And the earlier presentation, which is now marked as part one, was somehow unintentionally chopped towards the end. So I'm going to cover up the gap thereby created by redoing that part which was chopped. And so this is part two. So picking up where I left off, we were here now in the book, The Coming of David Messiah, where in chapter 8, we look again at the question of the appointed time. And this chapter is entitled The Appointed Time Revisited. So let me carry on by setting the sort of frame with this first paragraph. This chapter appeared originally in volume 1, which is The Appointed Time, the Tarrying and His Faith, that particular book, using material first written 2011-2012. The dates given at that time did not take into account the tarrying, which was spoken of there by Habakkuk in chapter 2, verse 3 of that book. Um, and I shall read it here just for the sake of setting the frame and being clear. So let me pick it up here in my trusty pocket Bible. Habakkuk chapter 2, and I'll start at verse 2. And the Lord answered me and said, Write the vision and make it plain upon tables, that he may run that readeth it. And verse 3. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, and that's where even the title of this talk, the title of this chapter, and the title of the book, the first book, volume 1, that's where that comes from, is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. So what had transpired was essentially the dates that I was being given in volume 1 for that Revelation chapter 14 verse 1 return of the Lamb to stand upon Mount Zion at the head of the 144,000. I was being given year 2014 for that. And that corresponded essentially to year 6001 on the Most High's calendar. So that marked, the nominal start of the seventh millennium. But nothing happened. Okay. Later on, I kind of got into an understanding of why that was erroneous and tracked it to this prophecy of Habakkuk that there would be a tarrying. And indeed, after having been given Urim and Thummim, the Most High then had me and guided me in writing the volume 3, which was on Yahweh's Enochian calendar. So after having been guided in the writing of Yahweh's Enochian calendar, it then became apparent what that tarrying might have amounted to. Okay, so carrying on here with this paragraph. Subsequently, in volume 3, I was given and reported, along with the revised 365 and a quarter day Enochian calendar, that the time of tarrying was exactly 4 years, after which the end time agenda started. So this chapter therefore sets out simply to revise the original, changing only the dates to reflect the now known tarrying of 4 years exactly. So that was the first 4-year correction for the tarrying, but in addition, there was a +1 correction that needed to be made, and that is spoken of here in footnote 168, which now let me read. It is unfortunately also necessary to correct certain dates by 1 year to reflect the fact that there is no year zero in going from BCE years to CE years. More precisely, in going from 1 BCE to 1 CE, the arithmetic difference is 2, since 1 for 1 CE minus 1 for 1 BCE equals 1 plus 1, which is 2, instead of just the 1 year difference that it clearly is. So going from 1 BCE to 1 CE, you're just going from 1 year to the next. So it's a 1 year difference, in fact. But if you do arithmetic with it, converting BCE years to minus and CE years, keeping them as plus, if you did that simple kind of naive arithmetic, you would get a difference of 2. So let me continue here with this footnote. For example, 2,500 years from a start date of 536 BCE should take us to 1965, not 1964. So we have to kind of make that plus 1 correction to reflect that there is no year zero. So in volume 1, I would have used 1964 for such piece of arithmetic, but really it should be 1965. And, one would have thought that a plus 1 difference here or there would not have made much difference, but in fact, it does make a difference. So we must also make that correction for BC to CE arithmetic. So continuing here with the footnote, we therefore must, in addition to a 4-year correction for tarrying, make a 1-year purely arithmetic correction to reflect the fact that there is an arithmetic jump in the labeling of years in going from 1 BC to 1 CE on the Gregorian calendar. So the combined correction is just 5 years, but in cases only where this arithmetic correction is relevant, because it is not always relevant. Okay, so with that in mind, I've taken what was earlier written as chapter, whatever it was, chapter 10, I believe it was, of volume 1, The Appointed Time, and now made all those corrections here along with various updates and commentary. So I will just go through that now to show what comes out for what is, as I have defined it, the appointed time. Okay, the appointed time being essentially that series of events that culminates in the bringing down of Babylon system and the raising back up of the Zion order and the throne of David. Okay, so that takes place over a series of years. Okay, so here now in the paragraph at the top, it says the start of the end time in hindsight. And I'm writing this now in 2021 as compared with the original writing of this work, which was as early as 2011 and 2012. So I'm saying here, in hindsight, was indeed Sunday, March 24th, 2019. Okay, the first day of the new year 6005 on the revised Enochian calendar, as I had been guided and published. And I'm going on to say that date I took to mean the literal date when Yeshua was to stand upon a physical Mount Zion with the 144,000 elect per Revelation 14:1. In that I was mistaken. Okay, and in fact, this is going off on a different idea here now, which is that event actually was an event in the spiritual, as I've already made clear, I believe in part 1. But In fact, I would also go further to what I say here now to suggest that actually 2017 could be more properly taken as the kickoff date. It wasn't the kickoff date for the start of the tarrying adjusted new millennium, which was 2019, year 6005, first day of the first month, year 6005, is exactly 4 years after the nominal start of the seventh millennium, which would be first day, first month, year 6001, obviously, right? But on a tarrying adjusted basis, it is actually year 6005. Okay, but the event of Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 to 5, which spoke of the woman clothed with the sun, the moon at her feet, 12 stars about her head, that configuration, astrological configuration in the sky, occurred on September 23rd, 2017. And indeed, that was when that man child, that strain to be delivered, was delivered, and that was that David Messiah. So, in fact, we could also equally suggest that 2017, September 23rd, was in fact the sort of kickoff for these end time prophecies. Okay, and that is the where I would now lean. Although year 6005, first day of the first month, year 6005, is indeed the tarrying adjusted start of the new millennium. Okay, well, let me now go to the preface where I looked at this whole issue of the what I call the year of millennial reset. And so let me talk a little bit about that. Um, okay, so let's go here. All right, let me at the second to last paragraph on the page to the left. Let me read from that. Thus, although wrong as to what precisely was to happen on that date, Sunday, 24th March 2019, which also corresponds to the first day of the new year 6005 on the Enochian calendar, it seems now in hindsight that that date did indeed mark the beginning of the end time events scheduled for the seventh millennium. That is, with a tarrying of exactly 4 years, the seventh millennium, although nominally started on the first day of year 6001, by definition, started rather on the first day of year 6005 for the purposes of the end time timetable of judgment and redemption. Judgment on Babylon, redemption of Zion. So, what was special about Sunday, March 24th, 2019? As mentioned, it was the first day of the year 6005 on the revised Enochian calendar. But it was significant also in the following precise sense. The day previous marked an end of each of the following cycles. A daily cycle, obviously, a weekly cycle, because the day previous was the seventh day Shabbat, right? So Sunday, March 24th, started a new week as well. A monthly cycle, so the day previous marked also a day of spring equinox, and therefore the end of the 12th month on the Enochian calendar, so that the day before was the end of winter, the spring equinox, and so the day following would have started um, the new spring and the new year. I don't know if I got that out quite right, but if you think a little bit about it, it will be clear. D, a yearly cycle. So the spring equinox is also the end of the 12th month. So the spring equinox, which took place the day before, was actually the end of the winter, okay, the previous winter. And ipso facto, the end of an Enochian, revised or otherwise, year. E, a 4-year leap cycle. So year 6004 is 4 divisible, and therefore a 366-day leap year on the revised Enochian calendar. And F, a 60-year cycle for the return to the condition as existed just the day prior to year 1, day 1 in the garden. Okay, which is the day that Adam would have been created, and so he would have been up that day to see the first sunset, so to say. And this is in terms that there's a 6-year cycle connected with that in terms of relative position of sun and moon as they started together in the fourth portal of the eastern sky. Now that gets a little bit technical. There's a footnote that explains some of that, but I'm not going to get into those details. You can look at the book. The year then following New Year, year 6005, thus marked a reset of all the cycles listed, right? So year 6005 is also the first year after the nominal start of the 7th millennium, year 6001, when all the foregoing cycles start afresh. So it does also mark the conclusion of the millennial tarrying, and therefore correspondingly the tarrying adjusted start of the new millennium. So you see why indeed there was a tarrying, because we needed, after going from 364-day return cycles to now 365 and a quarter days on average, you want the new millennium to be to align with the fresh start of all of these cycles. If it was still a 364-day return cycle for the spring equinox, then the nominal start of the new millennium, 6001, would also have been a new year, right, starting right after all of these cycles would have been ended. You see, so when it was changed to 365 and a quarter days on average, there needed to be a sort of a new idea, and I have this concept here in the next paragraph, a new idea of when the new millennium starts after adjusting for all of these cycles, all now having to have come to a conclusion before you now start the new millennium. I hope that makes sense. So going on to this paragraph here, thus year 6005 could be deemed the, and I introduced this sort of terrible phrase, millennial year of grand reset, to coin a term. So for the present 7th millennium, it comes exactly 4 years after its nominal start. Year 6005, which is 2019 on Gregorian, versus year 6001, the nominal start of the new millennium, corresponding to Gregorian 2015. I said 2014 earlier, but I should have said 2015. So this is how is determined the number of years of tarrying that are necessary. Okay. Um, and let me just make a note of this footnote 15 here. The tarrying of Habakkuk 2 verse 3 is thus that least number of years necessary for a return to a year one state, except for the precise day of week on which the new year starts, after the nominal start of the new millennium in year 6001. So for the seventh millennium, the tarrying as so defined is exactly 4 years. And it is interesting to note that for the eighth millennium, a similar calculation would give a tarrying of 12 years for the events then scheduled, should Yahweh so will. Right? So to get a grand millennial year of reset for the eighth millennium, you would have to have a tarrying of 12 years. All right. So that concept, I hope, is now clearly understood. And so with that, let me go back to where we were here in chapter 8, at the head of chapter 8, and go over the calculations that were earlier given in volume 1, that book, The Appointed Time, The Tarrying, and etc., and see what now comes out after we make the 4-year plus 1 correction. But before I do that, I also want to kind of set the stage, because we're talking about end time events, isn't it? And we now have plenty of evidence that we are now in the throes, in the middle of these end time events. So let me bring back to memory um, some of what has been going on that lets us to know that indeed we are in the middle of the end time events. So reading from here now. As this is written in October 2021, it should now be clear that the Most High is indeed now visiting the earth as prophesied in Scripture. Well, the Most High, of course, He sent the Archangel Michael is now standing up for His people, as that's there in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. So the whole host of, and His host, the whole host of angels are in fact doing all the necessary. Plague upon plague has been unleashed, all seemingly unprecedented in frequency and severity of occurrence. Item A. COVID-19 is the plague that is most noteworthy, as it has changed life as we know it on the planet and brought about death and devastation on a scale surpassing the Spanish flu, with no clear victory, quote unquote, for those who refuse to see the hand of the Most High present and act accordingly, yet in sight. Those disproportionately affected are the Gentile nations, identified, see Psalms 83, verses 1 to 8, as the enemies of the Most High and His chosen, notably of the Nega, or the Amagadedi. Conversely, the peoples left relatively unscathed for the most part are the Negro/Bantu people of Africa and the West. Likewise, every other familiar plague is now unleashed, seemingly with an unprecedented fury. Item B. Wildfires have consumed large parts of the western United States and Canada, British Columbia, Oregon, California, and elsewhere. Multi-million-dollar homes of the rich, for example, in Lake Tahoe, have been destroyed. This we had not seen much before. Likewise, Hurricane Ida unleashed special fury on rich areas of Louisiana, seeming to change the usual case of poor black folk being worst hit. It is indeed as if the blessing is being removed from the tabernacles of Edom and his Psalms 83 confederates, as elsewhere also prophesied at Psalms 108, and I quote from verse 7, God hath spoken in his holiness. I will rejoice. I will divide Shechem and mete out the valley of Sukkot. Verse 8, Gilead is mine, Manasseh is mine, Ephraim also is the strength of mine head, Judah my lawgiver. 9, Moab is my washpot, over Edom will I cast out my shoe, over Philistia will I triumph. 10, who will bring me into the strong city? Who will lead me into Edom? Wilt not thou, O God, who hast cast us off? And wilt not thou, O God, go forth with our hosts? 12. Give us help from trouble, for vain is the help of man. 13. Through God we shall do valiantly, or he it is that shall tread down our enemies. So this is being the Most High is doing this work on our behalf, and I think I've already mentioned that the sort of siege, Zion is now laying siege upon Babylon, and that started to the date 2625 years after Babylon first laid siege on Jerusalem, which was the 10th month of the 10th day, whatever year that was, 2625 years ago. And then actually, I know what that date was in terms of the Gregorian calendar. It would have been December 31st, 606 BC. So Zion, through the hand of the Most High, started laying now siege upon Babylon on December 31st, 2021, the 10th day of the 10th month, year 6000 and what was it, 6007 on the Most High's calendar. That's when Zion started laying siege on Babylon. Okay, and I referred to that in the demand letter upon the Catholic Church and the State of Israel, as the first upload to this David Messiah YouTube channel. Okay, so, and I continue here now with this list item B. I'm reading, the Most High is visiting to uphold his people, Gilead, Manasseh, Ephraim, Judah, among others, while delivering judgment on his Psalms 83 enemies, Edom, Moab, Philistia, among others. So Edom's easy dominion over the earth is being stripped away. Edomite countries of the Balkans and the Mediterranean also, conspicuously, have been plagued by wildfires. Spain and Greece and Turkey and Sicily and Sardinia and Crete come to mind. Russia, likewise, has been battling the same wildfire in Siberia for months, affecting millions of acres. Let me jump down to list item C now. Volcanoes have sprung to life seemingly everywhere. Cumbre Vieja well, they say Spain, but really it's at La Palma Island and the Canaries. Mount Kilauea in Hawaii, Indonesia, Peru, St. Vincent, Japan. All these cases spring easily to mind. Item D. Flood and tempest are doing the job. where lives and economies are not devastated by fire and volcanic lava and ash. Germany, Belgium, France, Britain, Spain, China, the US, and in the US, the states of New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Tennessee, Louisiana, country of Mexico have all been affected, and in a scale catastrophic and well repeated within mere weeks, and as well repeated within mere weeks in some cases. The scenes are horrific. For example, in China, hundreds of commuter cars trapped in a flooded tunnel, subway riders trapped seeing the water rise. That was streamed over the internet. Some cases in the US, Waverly, Tennessee, Rock Creek in Maryland, and others even defy analysis as insufficiently explained by the known rainfall events. So the question was, from where did the flood waters come? And with a force sufficient to move houses off their foundation, and not just to seep through, but to smash through doors and windows of basement apartments. All of that is unexplained and unprecedented. More prosaically, but nonetheless just as devastating, are floods occurring in India, Indonesia, Japan, Australia, and other places east. Landslides have occurred notably in Brazil, in India, Japan, not just blocking but taking whole mountain roads with them and burying whole villages in some cases. Item E. Snow has been seen in some very unlikely places in South Africa and Lesotho and parts of Brazil and Australia, where this is otherwise unheard of. Item F. Hail has repeatedly made an appearance in Italy, in Mexico, in Spain, in Australia, in Colombia, and elsewhere, causing extensive damage to cars and to property. And G, not to leave that out, a plague of rats has devastated Australia and New York City. These events are often described as apocalyptic, and rightly so. This is the hand of the Most High, raised in judgment against the enemies of his people and of himself. Only those in willful denial will refuse to see it, reaching rather for naturalistic, scientistic explanations, they call it climate change, rather than acknowledging the apocalyptic explanation that says simply that the Most High is visiting, as he said he would. And this is what esteemed brother Big Levi talks about quite a bit as he chronicles these events, and where he, in every one of those, we call them chronicles, he pulls out the apocalypse of Abraham, which describes what would happen in these terms precisely, in terms of fiery conflagrations and floods and etc. and etc. So these are the birth pangs spoken of in Scripture, that, like a woman's labor pains, when time draws near for the birth, will gather in frequency and intensity. So these birth pangs are to culminate in that day of promise, and that day of promise is that Babylon is to be brought down, Edom's dominion in the world is to end. In its turn, Negro Judah, the Amagededi, the tribe of Judah, whatever term you wish to use for us as the Negro people on the planet, is to rise to exercise the dominion. And that is there, Genesis 15:13-14, Genesis 49:10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, Daniel 7:18, which says, and Israel will take the kingdom and rule forever, even forever and ever. Second Ezra chapter 6 verse 9, which says that the Esau is the end of one world, and Jacob is the beginning of the world right to follow thereafter. Ezekiel chapter 34, 23, 24, Hosea chapter 3 verse 5, Isaiah chapter 11 verse 1 and 6, which even talks about turning of the tables, that, those who were the servants or who were the masters would now become the servants. It's as simple and as basic as that. And other verses, other chapters of the book of Isaiah likewise. Isaiah chapter 60 is there, verses 12 and 14. There's Jeremiah chapter 30, Jeremiah chapter 33, Psalms 108 I've just quoted from, Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, Revelation in various places and elsewhere. So this is what he said the essential sort of appointed time is to embrace. The throne of David is to be restored, and the David Messiah of promise and prophecy is to exercise that dominion in righteousness, in peace, and in truth. And indeed it shall come to be that he shall be a light unto the Gentiles. They shall look to him. They shall want to cleave to him. Of the increase of his government there shall be no end. And on and on and on in Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. So, the meek shall inherit the earth, which is Negro Judah in particular, because if anything at all for the last 400 years, we have been the meek of the earth. We have been the ones made to lie as the ground, and everyone else has walked all over us. How further meek can you be? Okay, so the meek shall inherit the earth, the Negro in particular, as well as all those that cleave to him. The wicked will be swept off. That process with the evidence of plagues already unleashed. For the brief recitation given above includes only events occurring within just the 2 years, 2020, year 6006, on the Most High's calendar, and 2021, year 6007, well matching the appointed time discussed now later in the present chapter. So this is now all well underway. This indeed is what we see when we look again at the end time timetable as adjusted now only for the 4-year tarrying, and that's not quite correct, plus a 1-year change where relevant. Okay, so as now presented, this chapter shows the dates earlier given in volume 1, but now revised for that now known 4-year tarrying, plus a 1-year where relevant for BC to CE arithmetic. So in each case, the original date is given, and the corresponding revised date as set side by side with the revised dates printed in red and in bold italic typeface. All right, so what now follows is the original with amendments as just described, along with such updating comments as necessary. So I'll just sort of skim through here, keying on the red. So where we had before year 2014 for a return of, I say Yahweh, but really it should have been Yahweh. So 2014 changes to 2019, and that was a Sunday, March 24, 2019, year 1 of year 6005. And here again, 2014 changes to 2019. Otherwise, the prophecies, or rather the results, are unchanged. All right, so here was the Hosea timeline. Hosea chapter 6, verse 2, which talks about him putting us to sleep and after 2 days he would wake us up and raise us up again. So with that, the start date for this prophecy of 725 BC, day one ends in year 275, day one being 1,000 years in effect. Then day two ends year 1276 AD or CE, and that would be 6 p.m. On that sort of Hosea's clock. And then day three would go from 1276 to 2276. And this analysis was first done in 2010, which corresponded at that time to 11:37 a.m. on that clock after adjusting. And I don't show it here on this graphic, but 12 noon on this clock in day three is actually the year 2025. 2025 is high noon on day three on this Hosea clock. So bear that in mind. I may have mentioned it in the text. Yeah, I did mention it in the text. It is interesting now, at the very bottom line here of the text of that page, it is interesting now to note that 12 noon on that clock corresponds to the year 2025. Okay, then there were the testimonies of Daniel, which could be taken as prophetic, obviously in terms of pointing towards the appointed time. So for the Daniel 12:7 timeline, we see a start of 536 BC, which corresponded to the first year of Darius the Mede, actually. And when we look forward to, I think it was for a time and times and a half of a time being taken to be 1,000 years. So 536 BC plus 1,000 years brings us to 465, making use of the plus one correction of the arithmetic. Then another 1,000 years brings us to 1465. And then a half a time, add another 500 years, brings us to 1965 AD. But because half a time was to be taken not as an exact 500 years, but as a sort of a fuzzy notion of a half a time, you at least a plus or minus 50 is allowed for that. So applying that range, we get 2019 for the end of that range. Okay, that's according to the Daniel 12:7 timeline. So these testimonies were basically corroborating each other and certainly not inconsistent with each other. Then there was Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. This is for the 70 weeks are determined, and etc. and etc. And that would have started 1951. I was so guided, corresponding to the year that the Israeli soldiers did an incursion into Jerusalem, and that was sort of mirroring what had happened in the case of when Nebuchadnezzar, the first kingdom, when Nebuchadnezzar had taken over Jerusalem, and he was given 70 years. And during those 70 years, he was well able to subdue all the nations around about. Right, so Nebuchadnezzar had obviously made his incursion, laid siege to Jerusalem, and sort of started off the countdown of 70 years. Well, here now the Gentile so-called Jews who went into that land and established that state in 1948, they made an incursion in what was called the Sharafat massacre in Jerusalem around 1951. So that started a 70-year countdown, where the reference in that scripture to weeks actually is a reference to Shabuas. And a Shabua is a 7-week period which occurs once a year on the Hebrew calendar. So in every year there's a Shabua. That 7 weeks, yes, that time period, 7 by 7, 49 and 1, 50. That time period between Passover and then the Pentecost. Okay. So that occurs once a year on the Hebrew calendar. So a reference to Shabua is implicitly is not a reference to a week or even a 7-year period, but rather to a year. Okay, that was the guidance I was given. Anyway, when you do that, you end up with a projection to 2025. Okay, after making correction for a 4-year delay. So 2025, as we see there in table 8.1, and we would have had instead of a count of 70 Pentecosts, it would have been 74 Pentecosts to get that. Okay, so and here now table 8.2, I actually made an error here. I added 5 years more or less automatically, and I should have added simply 4 years because we're going from 1951 to 2021. So the BCE to CE +1 correction is not at all required, and so I needed only to add 4 years. So 21 plus 4 will give you 2025. So in line number 7 of table 8.2, in red, that year should not be 2026 but 2025. Okay, I'm not going to look at all of these things. I'm just sort of bringing you to that 2019 to 2025 period, 2019 corresponding to year 6005. But in fact, as I said, if we go earlier to 2017, which was year 6003, to when that man-child was birthed in accordance with the prophecy of Revelation chapter 12. And here now there is an issue. I say there's a Pentecost 2022 proclamation as to David the Messiah. And this this Pentecost 2022 date is per specific guidance unrelated to the general 4-year tarrying, otherwise applicable. And indeed, I have been given something to that effect, and that is essentially, at this point, private. It is, I think I may have mentioned, yes, I did mention, that I was made to understand that it didn't happen, well, it's a little bit murky because of the guidance I get. I get guidance stuff every day. So let me not say any more about this Pentecost 2022. But let me read this paragraph here now at the top of the page. At that time, the first fruits offering will be the bride, those that will endure and remain of the tribulation. So after all the hail and fiery conflagrations and COVID and now monkeypox is there and etc. and etc. Those that will endure and remain of those there will be the bride. The tribulation shall have been shortened in accordance with Yeshua's prophecy, Matthew 24:22, specifically from the period 2019 to 2025 on the original schedule to 2019 to 2022. That is, the tarrying delays the start, 2015 to 2019, and the shortening brings forward the end from 2025 to 2022. Um, but I need to say something here. I'm not taking away from the finding as to 2025. But what I'm saying is that there will be some who will have the benefit of that shortening. The shortening doesn't apply to everybody. I don't know if that is going to make sense. Let me carry on in the next paragraph. Note in this regard that just as there are two first fruits offerings associated with any Shabua, one at the beginning pertaining to the feast of unleavened bread, right, which follows immediately after the Passover, and the other at the end at the feast of Shavuot or Pentecost, pertaining to leavened bread, so too there are two first fruits offerings associated with the redemption of Israel. The first pertains to the 144,000 elect and are the unleavened. The second pertains to the bride and are the leavened. So the former would have been spared the great tribulation altogether, being without fault before the Most High. The latter are those of the children and house of Israel that would have endured and remain at the end. The bride will be gathered at Pentecost 2024. And I put a note here, per Urim, but this date is not yet definite in accordance with Paul's testimony, 1 Thessalonians 4:17. They will have benefited from the shortening promised by Yeshua. So, okay. I think I've gotten myself slightly confused here, but I'm not going to try to disentangle it. The book is there. You can read it. It must be remarked that the shortening of those days does not apply to the building of the temple, for which 7 years is scheduled after the commandment to do so. Well, let me not get into that. Testimony of Daniel 8:14. So this is 8:14, 12:11, and 12:12 timeline. And so we getting to 2019, so 536 BC. I have here the death of Daniel. Actually, that was the first year of Darius the Mede. So a 5-year change is required, and that gives us the 2019. So this is times, and what was it, 2300? That's 2300 days. 2300 days, yes, of Daniel 8:14. Okay. Then there's a testimony of Daniel 7 and 25, which is the time and times and the dividing of time. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. So this was the fourth kingdom in specific. And so there was a start to that. So And a dividing of time was not a half a time, so a dividing of time, a time being 1,000 years. So time is 1,000 years, and times add another 1,000, that's 2,000 years. And the dividing of time add essentially a quarter of 1,000 years, which is 250 years, but with a range of uncertainty allowed because of the fuzziness of the term dividing of time. So at least equal to what was there for a half a time. So at least a 50-year sort of range of error on either side. And that gives us the Daniel 8:14 timeline. Yes, this one here. So time and time and a quarter of a time. Yes, time times a quarter of a time. And that brings us to 2019 also. And also there was a cleansing there, which is given for 2024. Well, let's leave that alone. That doesn't help us. Okay. So that is what we are looking at. Here is table 8.3, overview of the time-related prophecies. And as you can see, it is 2019 essentially for this return, this sort of key year, 6005, in the end times sort of agenda, 4 year with a 4-year tarrying. And then we have year 2025, essentially for all things to have ended. So if we look here at line 6, the end event is the end of the beast dominion, and we're looking at something of the order of 2025 for that. All right. So this is what this talk is about, the appointed time, and essentially what we're looking at is if we start with the seventh millennium as adjusted for the tarrying, that would take us to 2019. In any case, we're going looking to a range ending in 2025 for the end time events. If we start with Revelation 12 prophecy as to the birth of the man child that occurred earlier in year 6003 on the Most High's calendar, or that would be, 2017. So 2017 to 2025 is that total sort of period. And recognizing that what happened in 2017, let's keep it on the Most High's calendar, it was 6003 on the first day of the seventh month. So effectively, it would have started on that half year in year 6003. Because all these events are sort of tied to the Most High's calendar. So it is either that day of trumpets, it's a day of Passover, it's a Pentecost, it's key to these dates on the Most High's calendar. So that when we go to 2025, which is year 6011 on the Most High's calendar, I would expect all would have been complete by the 6th month of that year 6011. Okay, or maybe just carrying over into the day of that 7th month, the day of trumpets, or maybe the day of atonement. Might even go as far as the feast of tabernacles. Okay, which starts around the 14th day of the 7th month. So something like that. I didn't go into that level of detail in this book, but just to sort of give you that sense. Because if you do a simple sort of a scan, 2017 to 2024 is what, 7 years, right? But we're going into 2025, which is 8 years, right? So there are 8 years involved, distinct years, but if you measure sort of the start time to the end time, it might just be 7 years. That is what I'm trying to get at. Okay. So that is what I wanted to bring to you. And I don't think there is anything else that I want to add to that. So with that, and I will not try to give a summative sort of overview. Um, so I will just let that stay there, giving all praise, all glory, all thanks, all exaltation unto the Most High, Yahweh, Bahashem, Yeshua, and to all those who are still listening, Shalom.